Salutations, one and all, and welcome to RWBY Revisited. This time, let's talk about weapons. Who doesn't love them? I want to preface this by saying that I know that the show follows the rule of cool for its combat, and this is just something for fun to analyze how these weapons would or wouldn't work in reality. Please note that spoilers for all volumes will follow, and any material revealed or explained in supplementary material won't be weighted as heavily as that which is seen in the show. Funnily enough, I've had this idea in the works for a while, but recently Scholagrim did a very similar video on this topic, so now I feel dumb.
Stupid! Stupid! Stupid!
But let's press on anyway. There's still plenty to talk about on this subject. So where better to begin than with Crescent Rose? It's one of the first things we ever saw of RWBY, being featured with RWBY herself in the Red trailer, before the Grimm were more than just black silhouettes. So how would it function in real life?
It's cool, just cool.
Well, for starters, it'd be heavy. This thing is huge, and given that it appears to be made completely out of metal, it wouldn't be something you could just swing around like RWBY does. People have this misconception that swords and other weapons are heavy and slow, but that isn't the case. A well-made sword, axe, or other weapon is generally made to be pretty light. After all, it's hard to hit someone when you can't move your weapon quickly. Not only that, but most of its substantial weight is out on the end of the weapon. Axes, maces, and hammers feel heavier than they are because most of their weight is on the end away from your hand. I'd be surprised if most people could even swing this scythe.
She weighs 150 kilograms and fires $200 custom tool cartridges at 10,000 rounds per minute.
But speaking of scythes, there's the issue that they're poor weapons. Let's take a look at what happens when RWBY swings Crescent Rose. Most likely, she'd end up hitting her target with the top of Crescent Rose and not with the blade. Crescent Rose curves very drastically, which would make it really difficult to land a precise hit with the tip of the blade. That's another problem with scythes. The blade is pointed downwards, and it's curved backwards, making it even harder to hit a target. You'd have to put the head of the scythe past your target, and then pull back towards yourself to deliver a cut. That just isn't feasible in a fight. Now, RWBY has on a few occasions demonstrated that she can rotate the head of Crescent Rose to make it a war scythe. The war scythe historically stems from when peasants needed to arm themselves, and they would take the head off of a scythe and rotate it 90 degrees to make it a more effective weapon to defend themselves with. This way, it can be used more like a spear, or occasionally cut with the blade. Granted, I would much rather have an axe or a spear, but this is definitely an improvement. This would make it much easier for RWBY to hit opponents with the blade of her weapon, but she doesn't use this mode often for some reason. Crescent Rose oddly has a blade on the back, but there's no way you'd actually be able to cut anything with it, so I guess it's just for show. But you probably could use that protrusion to deal blunt force damage to a target. Then on the other end of the haft, there are two small blades and a point. I can't recall any instances where RWBY has used these to attack anything, but this would be a great way to attack enemies if this section can be extended while Crescent Rose is folded up. RWBY's scythe is huge, so she can't use it in close quarters environments, like a narrow hallway. Crescent Rose also has very smooth surfaces, and that could possibly make it difficult to keep a steady grip. I don't generally like metal handles on weapons. I'd rather take something with a wooden grip, but you could possibly go with something like a rubberized grip, and historically leather and bone were used. But Crescent Rose has another problem. It has so many moving parts. It looks heckin' cool, but if this were to be created in reality, then this many moving parts makes it highly likely that the weapon could break. For every piece that has to move, it can be worn down over time, or have mud or dirt get jammed into it, rendering it unusable. Guns alone sometimes have this problem if they aren't maintained, so just imagine how much more Crescent Rose would need to be maintained to make sure that it could switch between melee and ranged modes. Lastly about Crescent Rose is that it sometimes appears to be a bolt action weapon, while other times it behaves like it's semi-auto. Now, I'm not as knowledgeable about firearms as I am about historical melee weapons, but unless RWBY altered Crescent Rose in some way, then this is an oversight.
They taught you to use one of the most dangerous weapons ever designed?
But speaking of scythes, RWBY was inspired by Crow. While I much prefer the look of Crescent Rose, Crow's Harbinger has some design aspects that make it a better weapon. Firstly, look at where the blade is. It's on the outside edge of the weapon, rather than the inside. This means that when Crow swings it, it'll behave more like an axe, and he'll be able to actually hit his target with the blade. Second, it has a smaller longsword form. Yes, the wiki claims that this is a greatsword, but proportionally, this is a longsword. This means that he has a bit more flexibility with how he approaches conflicts. Not only that, but he can also change it into a war scythe configuration, so that's another option. Then there's its ranged abilities. The wiki states that Crow's weapon has 2 shotgun barrels, but I can't recall any instances where it behaves like anything other than a pistol. We don't see it spread like many types of shotgun ammunition, and if these are slugs, then they don't have much visual distinction from other ammo types. Granted, the weight of that huge blade hanging off the bottom of the weapon would make handling it in pistol form unwieldy. Overall, while I much prefer the look of Crescent Rose, Harbinger has a much better design. It still has tons of moving parts, but that applies to any weapon that changes forms in this series. But we're not done with scythes yet, folks. While Crow inspired RWBY, he in turn was inspired by Maria, sort of making her the grandmother of RWBY's fighting style. While her flashback was certainly cool, her weapons are unusual, to put it lightly. We're unfortunately back to the blade being on the inside of the weapon, and the tip is curved downwards so drastically that using it to penetrate a target is going to be absurdly difficult. She does have the sense to use 2 of these though, making them more like kama or sickles than a scythe. She, interestingly, has gravity dust stored inside her weapons though, and it lets her do these cool moves where she can throw one and then use the other to create a pulling force with it. She even seems to be able to somehow activate this while she's not holding her weapons, and I have no clue how she achieved that. She even seems to be able to use this in ranged attacks. Finally, she can link the 2 sickles together at the handle to create a 2-handed weapon, but the blades point in opposite directions. This might allow for some more utility, being able to hook onto things, but it means that one side of her weapon will be much less effective than the other unless she flips it around, but then the other side would run into the same issue. But enough about scythes and sickles. They look cool, but aren't the most practical for real-life combat. What about the rest of Team RWBY? Weiss's Ancestor, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a modified rapier, a sensible real-world weapon. In the earlier seasons, I thought it was a small sword, just because of how the animation program in the first 3 seasons wasn't as advanced as what we have now. For reference, a small sword is shorter than a rapier, and it doesn't have a blade, and can only deal damage by thrusting. The only real flaws that I can see with Ancestor is that it hinges on a single point to let Weiss insert new dust cartridges. If she uses it to block a very powerful attack, then it might cause that hinge to flip open, or even break off in an extreme case. That, and it has no tang. The blade just sits on the end of the cylinder, and without a tang to extend into the hilt of the sword, then the integrity of the blade won't be as strong. Winter also uses a rapier, though hers doesn't possess the dust cartridge that Weiss's weapon does. Instead, she has an offhand dagger that can be stored within it. Now this does have some historical precedence. Wielding a rapier or small sword in your primary hand, while keeping a parrying dagger or swordbreaker in your offhand, was commonly used in duels. I have to wonder if the empty space that stores the dagger would lead to structural weaknesses in the rapier, but overall, it's an interesting piece of kit. Then there's Blake's Gambol Shroud. Now this blade has hinges on it. An issue that affects all weapons that have different configurations is that we almost never see how the characters change the mode of their weapons. Hinges like this would have to have a locking mechanism, which could possibly break under stress. That, or gunk and muck could possibly get into the hinges, causing them to jam open or closed. Something more alarming, when the weapon's in pistol configuration, the blade actually points back at the wielder. That's not something you ever want. If someone or something catches you by surprise, they could smash the weapon back into you, and then you're in a world of nope. The scabbard can function like a large cleaver, but its shape combined with its grip would make this awkward in real life. Also, this would mean that there's no completely safe way for Blake to carry her weapon, as there would always be an exposed edge. Then there's Ember Silica, Yang's shotgun gauntlets. As a concept, these are really cool. If we were to look at them in real life, however, there are some issues. First, a shotgun blast attached to your hands would not be fun. If the recoil doesn't break something, then you're certainly not going to be having a good time. But how does Yang fire these gauntlets? It can't just be the impact of her punching something, because Yang can punch things without firing them. They don't have any trigger that we can see, so that makes this very confusing. Her replacement arm could possibly connect to nerve endings like the rest of her prosthetics, letting her activate it with her brain, but even if that's the case, then it doesn't explain how her other gauntlet works. Also, was her right gauntlet ever recovered? Because it would be really amusing to see some survivor of Beacon using it if it was just left there with her arm. She can even outfit her weapons with micro-missiles, though I have no idea how they're compatible with the same space that fires shotgun shells. I also dislike how many weapons that come in pairs in this series have only one name. I mean, come on, you don't give twins one name, each weapon needs its own name. But speaking of weapons with janky names, there are Ren's pistols. Now, my experience with guns is more limited than pre-firearm weapons, swords all day, every day, but the pistol section of Stormflower seems to be fine, at least as far as I can tell. It's where the blades are positioned that makes them awkward. These giant blades positioned at the bottom of the pistols make using them very much akin to holding blades in a reverse grip. The problem with that is that this nerfs your reach, range of motion, and power with every attack that isn't a downward stab. Reverse grips, along with the position of these blades, would make it so difficult to effectively strike. Also, the blades are telescopic, meaning that the interior needs to be hollow. Being hollow is not good for a blade's structural integrity. Nora's Manghild, wow, some of these names are really unintuitive, is an interesting concept. The grenade launcher is self-explanatory, but I don't know about swinging explosives around when they're stored in the hammer's head. Modern explosives are pretty stable, but we don't know about Remnant's tech, and I still wouldn't want to smack something with explosive armaments that close to me. But let's get into some of the more niche weapons. Emerald's weapons look awesome. I have a huge bias for weapons that remind me of flails, I'm not gonna lie. Even though these are more like Kasurigama type weapons, the chain makes my brain go all warm and fuzzy. Unfortunately, chains that are that long would be ineffective in combat, and you can't just latch onto things in real life like she, Ren, and Blake do. A blade on the end of a flexible weapon is also next to impossible to achieve proper edge alignment with your target, rather than with using a blunt head. Sun's weapons, however, do not spark joy. It can form into either a staff, nunchucks, or be used as pistol nunchucks. As a fun gag, this is fine. If it were to be attempted in reality though, you might as well just throw yourself at your enemy's weapon. Nunchucks are a poor man's flail. You hit someone with nunchucks, and they'll say ow, and hit you back. If you hit someone with a flail, then they're in a world of trouble. That's because a flail both has more mass, and the spikes prevent it from rolling when it hits a target. A lot of people have the misconception that the spikes are supposed to penetrate and do damage. No, they're there to keep the head from rolling off of the target. Nunchucks don't have that. They're smooth cylinders, meaning that a lot of the little power that they generate won't go into the target because they'll roll. Similarly, a staff will almost never inflict enough damage in a single hit to stop something like a Grim from mauling you. Ironwood used dual pistols for the majority of his screen time until he replaced them with this clunky laser weapon. It's powerful, yes, but it's not ergonomic at all. Our weapons look the way they do for a reason, so that our bodies can use them properly. It's why the energy sword from Halo would be difficult for a Spartan to use. Its grip is designed for an entirely differently shaped hand. Holding a weapon out in front of you like that puts unnecessary strain on your limbs to hold it steady, so something like this would probably need to be mounted onto a vehicle or emplacement of some sort. Ironwood's cybernetics are likely the only reason he can use this thing. Then there's the fact that it has to charge up. That means that you have to start firing the weapon before you acquire your target, or they could just rush you before it fires. You need that damage now, not later. Neo's umbrella is strange. I'd love to know how it blocked not only one of Nora's grenades, but also negated all of the kinetic energy behind it. What? That, and while this would make for a great concealed weapon, it just doesn't have much use outside of thrusting. There are other weapons, but they've been seen much less. Again, this was meant to be a simple look for fun at what these weapons would be like if they were to be constructed in the real world. What's your favorite weapon in the series? Or what weapon would you wield if you were a huntsman or huntress? I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you found this video entertaining or informative, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe to see more. And may you all have a weapon in each hand.